I am not encouraging or advising anyone to modify their firearms. This is for entertainment and educational purposes only. What's up, everyone? This will be a detailed video about the 1911 trigger pre-travel and over-travel adjustment and what aspects of those adjustments I've been able to quantify for more consistency. This is kind of the last video in a series about how I do 1911 trigger jobs. There's a link in the description to a playlist of all my technical content, which includes the preceding videos and processes. I would recommend watching my 1911 trigger action demo video. You can click on the card here. It's also linked in the description. It's about 4 minutes long. It will hopefully provide more context for some things I talk about in this video. Let's get into it. The take-up length, or pre-travel, is the distance the trigger travels rearward from the beginning of the trigger press up to the wall. During this movement, the trigger bow is pivoting the disconnector back into contact with the sear legs. Once it makes contact with the sear, that's the wall. The location of the wall, or the rearward stop of the pre-travel, is fixed, and it's defined by the geometry of the frame, ignition components, and how they're all located with respect to one another. Pre-travel adjustment limits how far in front of the wall the trigger can travel. Pre-travel is adjusted by bending the tabs at the front curved area of the trigger bow to limit how far the trigger can come forward in the trigger bow groove. Sometimes trigger bows won't have these tabs and you cannot adjust the pre-travel. I have designed and 3D printed this jig to help us get a look at these adjustments because they're a bit hard to see inside of a pistol. You can see here the bow is up against the front of this trigger bow groove. Now I'm going to bend one of these little tabs forward, just like that. Now the trigger is stopping on that little tab and not this trigger bow. I have limited its forward travel and therefore reduced the distance it would need to travel backwards to the wall. Before I do any adjustments, I use a Sharpie to mark my trigger guard at the front bottom edge of the trigger. I'll remove this with a Q-tip and some alcohol later. Then I will press the trigger up to the wall and measure this distance with my calipers. This is approximate, but I generally want somewhere between 1 to 1.5 millimeters of pre-travel. This is just what I like the feel of. Some people may like more or less. However, some pre-travel is needed. If there isn't any, it may be partially disengaging the sear tip from the hammer hooks, and this is obviously a safety concern. To make an adjustment on a trigger with tabs on the bottom or the center of the trigger bow, the trigger needs to be removed from the frame. I unload all the ignition components and pull the trigger out the back of the frame, make my adjustment, reinstall the trigger, and reinstall the sear, disconnector, hammer and hammer strut, sear spring, and mainspring housing. This will give me the wall back to measure my take up against. Before I make any adjustments, I will take an initial measurement. Let's say it's 3 millimeters, but I want the take up to be 1 millimeter. I need to adjust the tab 2 millimeters in front of the trigger bow. I can roughly measure this before I reinstall it to get it as close as possible, so hopefully I don't have to tear the ignition components out a bunch of times. So check, disassemble, adjust, reassemble, repeat until I get close to the measurement I want. Generally, I adjust pre-travel first. It can require some disassembly, so once it's done, and I know I don't need to take the pistol apart again, then I adjust my over-travel. If the adjustment tab is on the top of the trigger bow, like in this double stack pistol, it's much easier. I can take my slide off, drop my hammer manually, pull the trigger all the way to the rear, then I can get in there with a little flat blade screwdriver and pry that adjustment tab out. I haven't tried this on a single stack, but presumably it would work if the tab was on top of the trigger bow. I think this may be more common to double stack pistols. Due to their modular frame and grip design, generally the whole grip module has to come off the frame for the trigger to come out. It's nice to be able to make that adjustment without doing that extra disassembly. Even if the trigger has 2 tabs, I only adjust one. It's very hard to get them adjusted both perfectly even, so it's only going to be stopping on one tab anyways. And one tab is more than strong enough to stop the forward movement of the trigger without bending or fatiguing. Adjust these tabs very carefully. It's easy to bend the trigger bow and that will cause you some problems. I generally use little needle nose pliers, as you saw me do before, a small flat blade screwdriver in the case of the double stack like I showed, or even a small punch, if the tabs look like this, I can kind of just pry them out like that. After the pre-travel of the trigger, there's the wall. Pulling the trigger through the wall releases the hammer. This is the trigger break. Over travel is how much the trigger bow can travel rearward after the trigger break. If the rearward travel is limited, it also limits how far it needs to travel forward to get to the reset. Less over travel means a shorter reset. The trigger stops traveling rearward when the trigger shoe contacts the magazine catch. Over travel is adjusted by turning this set screw in the trigger shoe. Some triggers don't have this screw and therefore don't have over travel adjustment. This screw sticks out the back of the trigger shoe. It will contact the mag catch first and the rearward travel of the trigger will be reduced. Over travel adjustment is done with the trigger in the pistol, usually with a little 50 thousandths hex key. The first step is to adjust the over travel screw in or clockwise, looking from this direction until the trigger no longer releases the hammer with a reasonable trigger pull force. If you pull the trigger with 15 pounds of force, it may still release where it wouldn't with a 5-pound pull. To control this, I pull with my mechanical spring gauge to a force of 2 pounds over the trigger break weight. This trigger is set right around 4 to 4¼ pounds. So I will pull the trigger with 6 pounds of force as measured by this gauge. I adjust the screw in about a quarter turn at a time. Then pull with the gauge until it no longer releases the hammer with 6 pounds of force. So there, I just pulled 6 pounds of force on it and the hammer did not release. Once I'm there, I adjust this screw back out counterclockwise a minimum of 1/2 turn and then confirm that the trigger releases the hammer at my original break weight. The swing you get within the trigger guard is about a quarter turn. So I do 2 of these and recheck. And we're back down to my original pull weight. So the over travel is now set on this trigger. Depending on the application of the pistol, if reliability is most important, say for defensive use, I would adjust the over travel screw back out 3/4 of a turn to 1 full turn. This allows more margin for operation in extreme conditions or if the pistol gets really dirty. If it's a range use only pistol or I'm after the most high performance, fastest trigger action, I may adjust it out less than 1/2 a turn if I can still maintain a clean break at my original break weight. Sometimes it takes a while to screw the over travel screw in until it starts taking out over travel. Sometimes you can sneak a ball end hex key in here like this. However, the hex key will scratch up your trigger guard. It's extra obvious if the frame is metal. Guess how I know this? So if I know I'm going to be using my hex key like this to make adjustments, I'll just wrap some tape around the trigger guard right here. The threads in polymer trigger shoes are generally tight enough on the screw so that it stays put once you adjust it. In steel and aluminum shoes, the screw is likely to spin freely in the threads and you may lose your adjustment over time. Some have little nylon locking inserts like this one. That's nice. But if it doesn't, before making the adjustment, I turn the screw all the way back this way until the threads are exposed. Then I would clean this off with some acetone or alcohol and apply a little dab of blue Loctite. Sometimes, before the last installation of the trigger, I'll have a brief moment of foresight and I will turn the screw all the way out the back of the shoe. Then I will clean the screw and also the internal threads while it's easy to do. On any trigger with an over travel screw, be careful backing the screw out too far this way. The hole in the trigger shoe is likely only big enough for the hex key and not the screw. If you try to back it out all the way, it will bind up against the back of the shoe face here. Then when you try to screw it back in, it strips the hex in the front of the screw. Then you try to get it unstuck with pliers after you realize you fucked up and it mangles the threads and you just ruined your new trigger. Guess how I know? All right, that wraps up this video. Hopefully you understand what pre-travel and over-travel are, how they're adjusted, and what exactly those adjustments are doing. Maybe some helpful tips and tricks to get it done and dial in your trigger action, or ways to avoid mistakes I have made in the past. Thanks so much for watching. Stay curious. I'll catch you next time.